Let's get started. So today we have three speakers in this session. My name is Chi Lee. I'm the physician executive in the product team. We also have Tom Dyar. Tom is a data scientist in the IRIS team. More importantly, we also have a customer, Bill Myers from Vibra Healthcare. We'll talk about the use cases that they have regarding NLP. I thought it would be very useful to incorporate a customer here and talk about the real-world use cases that they're seeing. Agenda-wise, I will start talking about the specific use case around the condition detection and the clinical trial matching. These are the two specific areas that we're working on. And also, then after that, Tom is going to talk about the development project that he has been working on, and more importantly is lesson learned and challenges that we're trying to overcome. And of course, we'll follow that by the Vibra use cases regarding how to use NLP to assess the clinical transfer eligibility. And so I'm not going to talk too much about that one, and he's going to go over that. But in the beginning, I think today's opening session was quite interesting. Data is very key, and everybody think that data is valuable, and it's the engine, and it's important. But on the other hand, also recognize that data is not that easily accessible. And one key element is around the data that's in the electronic clinical record, which could be, as a physician, I will document in the notes. I could, if I spend some time, I might be able to spend some time putting the electronic health record, but it's not always the case, right? So in this case, according to some of the journals that was published about the condition detection, condition meaning the clinical diagnoses, medical conditions. In this case, even for diabetes, about 38% of the diagnosed diabetic populations, they do not have a diagnosis in their medical records. Think about that, right? If you are creating rules and you are looking for patients with the diagnosis, you're not going to get all of them. And what's also interesting is that, of course, you can, in this case, they are identifying them looking at the diabetic medications. But still, it's a very big problem that many of the diagnoses are not in the medical records. What's also interesting, the business case is, for example, there's a CMS payment for certain for a patient with, in this case, diabetes, peripheral vascular diseases, and COPD, and it's about $10,000. But if you detect additional conditions, the reimbursement rate would go into $19,000, so that's an extra $9,000. So for many of the practices and provider organizations, the ability to detect additional conditions to generate additional revenues, that's a very strong business case. So I'll just put this out there. In this case, it was actually from a presentation at HIMSS 2016. One of the provider organizations talked about this business case. So I thought that was very useful. Today we also talked about artificial intelligence, machine learning, predictive models. So this is also where the structured data and unstructured text become a very important factor for you to consider. In this case, I was looking at some of the features. Now, this is from a project a company did that they talk about how they can predict congestive heart failure. And they're looking at features. I assume a lot of data scientists here. When I say feature, that's a data feature. In this case, there's ejection fraction, smoking indicators, cigarette pack days, congestive heart failure ICD-9 data, and also related terms, symptoms, and findings. And in this case, the second column, you can see that percentage encounters in the structured data for some of these are very low. The ICD-9 is very low. And also the related key terms is 0%, right? Even smoking status, smoking indicator is 43% in the structured data, even though there are many unstructured texts that contain that information. So this just shows you that in order to take advantage of Iris Health, take advantage of the machine learning or the AI work, that recognizing a lot of data features that you're looking for is actually in the unstructured text. And I'm looking at it very specifically, the condition detections. So that's one key use case. The second key use case that we are focusing on now is around the clinical trial matching. So tomorrow I have another session. And basically is to inform or maybe talking about how health information exchanges and IDNs, they are storing data that there's a way to monetize that through clinical trial matching, clinical trial support. So this goes to another challenge. Even with the clinical trial matching, we have to look at some of the problems that they're running into. So a big part of the clinical trial problem statement is many of the trials, almost half of those, they failed because of poor recruitment. And a lot of times in terms of resources, we really span down the patient recruitment, which is about 30%. What's also fascinating is that in the past decade, the eligibility criteria has increased in complexity, about 150% increase in the eligibility criteria. It used to be very simple diagnoses, conditions, and now it's getting a lot more complex. In terms of time perspective, there's a study by VCU talk about screening for observational study. On average, it takes almost about an hour. And for phase 3, it's about almost an hour as well. So it's very time consuming, and they had to go through many charts. For the phase 3 study, they had to look at 8 patient charts in order to find one, and each one of them will spend about 0.8 hours in this case. There's additional studies talked about. It's published by the Cincinnati Children's Hospital, looking at using NLP technology and AI technology, was able to reduce the workload by 85%, which is also a tremendous saving as you're looking at how to use the technology itself to improve your clinical trial matching, find the patient, find the appropriate trials for the patient. So all this NLP is very effective, and particularly from the labor cost point of view. So this is also another very important business case that we're looking at. And so this comes to why we are designing our internal project to evaluate it. So earlier I talked about the condition detection, which interestingly for the clinical trial matching, this is a study that really talk about the requirements. So typically there's an inclusion and exclusion criteria for the clinical trials. And it is a observational study. It was a real study looking at a patient with confirmed diagnosis of COPD, but also want to exclude patients and with a current or suspected diagnosis of asthma or cancer, malignancy. So there's multiple conditions that needs to be factored and considered when you want to look at a patient, but also the medications. There are medication classes, long-acting beta agonists, LABA, LAMA, all these therapeutic classes, oral corticosteroids and inhalers, and all these things that needs to be considered in the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So many of these information are indeed in the structured, unstructured text, so we had to factor all of them in. And another important area is around for the COPD patient, is also looking at the pulmonary function test, which is the FEV1 predictive value of 50% to 80%, for example. So lots of information. What we found is many of the hospitals, these type of pulmonary function tests is actually in the text report. It's not nicely documented like a blood pressure. No, it's not. It's usually in a free text report. So that seems to be the case. So we think that, first of all, is that for clinical trial matching, we think there's a good clinical use case, business use case. But when we dive into the details, we found that, boy, we really need a fairly strong natural language processing technology. So with that, we internally designed a development project and looking at a customer's data set and try to build solutions, build the technologies to address this challenge. So with that, I'm going to change to give this to Tom.
Thank you, Chi. So in addition to working on this project, I'm not really a data scientist at InterSystems. I'm a product specialist, and my main responsibilities are in kind of product management, but I'm really looking at AI and machine learning. And this was a great thing to start with. I just started in InterSystems in February to get my hands on with the technology and just try to get something done in this space, which there's so much opportunity. So the overall kind of agenda, what I'm going to talk about a little bit about the environment, kind of what we were thinking when we put together this kind of experiment or hypotheses, and the different types of approaches that we're looking at as far as how you do NLP, and then looking forward how things are changing within the NLP world with deep learning. There's a lot of very interesting things happening in NLP, so I'll touch on those. And we're going to look forward. So although I don't have any data to really show because things are just in flux and there's always roadblocks and things, we're going to talk about how we would set this up, this environment, to really tackle these problems in a more general way. So the TechSpring HealthShare innovation platform is a mouthful. Okay, but there is a large healthcare system, Bay State Health, and they have an innovation arm. So we're looking at a data set that we have access to as part of our sponsorship of TechSpring. 789,000 patients, all these big numbers here. And so there's a big data set that's real healthcare data, and we can look at all the notes and correlate back to whatever structured data we have within HealthShare and Health Insight. Quite a bit of data to look at. So we have a particular clinical trial that we're looking at. So Chi just touched on a bit of the criteria, but we're looking at really trying to focus on finding these diagnoses that are maybe not very well annotated within the structured data. So COPD, asthma, cancer, they're chronic diseases. Sometimes they get mentioned as part of a note, and you might be able to glean that there's something there that may impact your eligibility for the trial. As far as medication, just finding these different classes of drugs, you want to look at a wide range of drugs. You can't just look for just these keywords. You have whole families of drugs, and you want to have things like ontologies that reflect those classes of drugs, and that's not always easy. So that's another focus of looking at these at this data. And then getting these pulmonary function tests, PFTs. They're often semi-structured. They can take form of a PDF or something within the note. So being able to get things out of the notes in from semi-structured data back out makes you think that all of these things are different, and really argues for a very general approach. And that's not necessarily how a lot of traditional kind of NLP can handle. Of course, there's built into IRIS. We have INO. It's really called InterSystems NLP now, and it has its own unique way of looking at text and just looking at it from a very grammatical base, and it's very flexible, super flexible. You can just start with no hypotheses and get a lot of structured data out of your unstructured data from that. You can do simple mappings, and as well you can do very complicated mappings to things like ontologies like UMLS. And critically, for these clinical trial cohort eligibility, it has pretty strong negation support, so it can detect when a term is being negated. And this is also the case. So some of these things are also pretty well handled with the open source Ctakes, which we're starting to look at. Now, on the other hand, once you run these engines, they generate a boat ton of data on the back end, and that's one of the issues that we've had, is that this TechSpring sandbox has not been set up to do large-scale NLP experiments. However, all the data has to stay within their firewall. So any kind of additional kind of capacity needs to be put there, at least in the current setup. So we're figuring that out. And of course, it's just a little bit rigid for some of these things. So this just gives you the standard Ctakes kind of pipeline as a sentence that goes in at the top. You've got to you have all these different pieces that are shown on the left that get run one after another. Sometimes they interact with each other because you might do some part of speech tagging, then you do chunking, and you figure it out, you didn't do it right. So they have some interaction sometimes. But all of these are either tunable or hand-tuned. They might have some machine learning that makes them flexible. But overall, they're pretty much kind of hand-built, and all based on a lot of the history of NLP, some of the cognitive theories about language, and semantics, but has been built up over time, as kind of a programming project. So what's happening recently, though, is that deep learning is overcoming the capabilities of these hand-tuned systems. So just looking at kind of detecting phenotypes, which is really kind of condition detection in a way, for different I2B2 tasks. This one, back a couple of years ago, this is from 2017, found that this deep learning technique in the blue bar pretty much matches across all of those different tasks, matches or exceeds the performance of a hand-tuned kind of traditional NLP. So actually, overall in NLP, we're experiencing an explosion of approaches within deep learning that are causing incredible increases in the accuracy. And it's starting to get pretty wild, because one of the lost my train of thought. One of the things that happened recently, which was very similar to what happened in image processing, and now just happened with an NLP, is that there was a special task, this question answering task, given a bunch of text that has some data, ask some questions about it, and compare that performance of how well you answer those questions with the performance of a human. And now some of these NLP systems are answering the questions better than humans in a very general kind of way. And what's driving all that? Well, I like this picture because it's these titans. It's Google, maybe on the left, Facebook on the right, or Microsoft. They're fighting it out in very public view. And what's dropping out, and the way they're doing it, is in open source, and they're engaging all of the academics, all working pretty much together and cooperating in open source, developing these technologies, and it's pretty exciting. So a little bit more about deep learning, where that is going, or what it is. This slide is just from some O'Reilly article. I can't take any credit for it, okay? I didn't put the exact URL, but you might be able to find it. Hey, you could do Google image search on this. So anyways, what it shows on the right is that you put in a raw image, and at the bottom it's a raw image. The first step of the processing within these layered networks is to just pick out edges and angles, and then at the next level, going a little bit higher up, you get little collections of features like eyes. And then eventually at the top, you're recognizing faces. And this has been tried for a long time. And really neural networks started in the late 80s, or in the 80s. Of course, they were invented way before then. And there were a lot of advances then. But it kind of ground out because, well, the hardware wasn't quite where it needed to be. But also there was some mathematical tricks that actually allowed this to happen. And you see that in the red down below. There's a prior. And they started using Bayesian statistics to actually constrain the way that those weights are being learned, that there is some compositionality. That's basically the hypothesis, that faces are made up of eyes and other parts. And once you do that and you have enough power, you'll eventually learn and self-learn features. Same thing happens in auditory there on the right. So that brings us to, so those were two different kind of fields, right? You've got image processing, auditory speech recognition. Deep learning has taken over all of those previously hand-tuned kind of systems that used to do speech recognition, and now is just completely taken over by just running things through deep learning models. So in natural language processing, that didn't quite happen so well. There's some differences in natural language. Of course, you've got long-range dependencies, you've got long sentences, long passages, and you need to somehow be able to do this dependency kind of detection across those. Also, text is different. It's not spatially laid out necessarily. It's sequential. It has different things. So there's been a lot of techniques that have been developed. And so the latest kind of advances are these transformers. So BERT is, Google released BERT, and it's a very large, like gigabytes and gigabytes of a model, millions of parameters. I think it's probably over 100 million parameters. And it's been able to, you basically self-train it. You send it a whole bunch of text, whatever it is. It could be any open text. And the way the training works is that it learns how to predict the text that it sees by masking out different words or subwords. So it takes in a whole sentence, and 15% of the words will be blanked out. So it knows the answer. So then it can detect, it tries to fill in those missing words and trains itself, essentially, gets a signal each sentence that it sees. The other kind of interesting part is that on this side is they do a little bit of pre-processing of the data and take the words and just cut them into pieces. So that gets around like having to hand make a lemmatization and doing the stemming. It basically does stemming in kind of a stochastic way and figures out the best way to stem different words. And using all of those millions of parameters. So you learn this over a large amount of text, and then you develop a classifier that gets tagged onto it. That's in the box on the right, the W. And you can either fine-tune that model or just take the model as it is and learn a classifier on the end with very little labeled data. And that's what's exciting, is because one of the problems with NLP is having gold standard annotated data that's just not around for a lot of these notes or any types of things. And so with Clinical BERT, they've actually taken PubMed, and that way they can, when they learn on PubMed, it changes the model a bit so that it can understand scientific terms a little bit better. And then after they tuned it on that, then they put in a whole bunch of clinical notes from Mimic 3, which is a public data set that's been de-identified. And so when you put that in, you can make it even better at reading clinical notes and getting some of the specifics about notes. And then so anybody that has some gold standard data could be able to learn a classifier. And as I mentioned before, let me see, I didn't really set these slides out right, but what we did have with respect to this data set is that as part of the clinical trial cohort identification, we got 600 patients identified out of the 700 or 800,000 patients that are deemed eligible by basically a panel of reviewers. So there we have a gold standard data. We can use those to just detect whether or not this person is eligible for a trial, and that's kind of the approach that we're taking. So I just wanted to tell a little bit about kind of the tools I use. If anybody's interested in talking to me more, I'd be willing to share. But I'm a big proponent of R. I love R, but a lot of natural language processing stuff takes place in Python. So within RStudio, you can use both. And connecting to HealthShare, it's very simple with all of our connectivity options. We also have a Spark connector. So if we had a Spark cluster within TechSpring, which is kind of the next step, we'll be able to get that data very quickly into Spark and be able to do really sophisticated processing there. And then, and I'm even using Spark on just a single node because it gives you a lot of good kind of lazy evaluation, allows you to kind of set up your problem and only get the data that you want when you actually need it. And there's some other packages that are really interesting, which is the FF package allows you to do things that are bigger than memory, but actually have a data frame. It looks like a data frame that's in memory, but it's actually backed by a huge file that's on disk. And, as part of our kind of this whole project, we're starting to look at Python and using Spacey, which is another open source project, and Ctakes. So just looking at what we're doing, I wish I had data to share about how what we're finding and all that. And that's next time or very soon. But we we have we want to do some work in the cloud. Since I mentioned everything has to stay within this firewall, we still want to do some kind of prototyping on some data that we have access to. Some clinical notes from a 2014 challenge. We'll be able to just get access to all the GPUs that you need, which is one of the big kind of requirements for doing this kind of work, and then use that, whatever we learn from there, to kind of go back inside the firewall and fine-tune things with the data that's in TechSpring. And of course, I mentioned hard disk space and updating and reorganizing what we're doing with cache is something that's an ongoing project. Of course, upgrading to IRIS. So that's just kind of the lay of the land of what I'm up to, and I'd like to talk to people more about using IRIS for this kind of thing, using InterSystems products, and how we're going to make them better. So thank you very much.
My name is Bill Myers. I'm from Vibra. Healthcare, just a little bit about Vibra. Vibra is actually made up of two healthcare companies. Vibra are LTAC and rehab hospitals, and last fall we acquired a company called Earnest Healthcare. Total, probably around 60 hospitals, close to 30 states. Pull this map up. This just shows, and this will make a difference in what I'm going to talk about in a little bit. If you look, we have a very large geographic dispersion of hospitals. So one of the things we want to do is connect to health information exchanges to pull information in. Getting ahead of myself, so let's talk a little bit about LTAG and rehab patients. 99% of our patients come from an acute care hospital. We don't have emergency rooms. Patients don't come in off the street. They come to us from other hospitals. A large number of the time, they're LTAC patients, they're ICU acuity level patients. They're patients that have multiple systemic disease. They're very ill patients. The whole transfer process is not a fun process for the family, the patient. So what we want to try to do is make it as smooth as possible. We have patients that have complex comorbidities that create challenges to care. On our rehab side, we do a lot with cardiac, ortho, and neuro. Rehab creates additional challenges. To get to the point, what this means is we have these patients coming to us via referrals. We have clinical liaisons who are RNs that go out. They will sometimes do assessments of up to 10 patients a day. So they're in trying to make sense of these patients, what their medical needs are, how we can create the best situation for them and the best outcome. One of the things, we've got a couple guys from my shop here, they hear me say all the time, our clinicians, oftentimes it's like they're drinking from a fire hose. There's so much clinical data, they need to be able to very quickly look at it, determine what's important, what's not, and what really impacts our ability to provide these patients the care that they need. So challenges, patient acuity. Patients on the LTAC side especially come to us with complex conditions. It's very difficult to go through all of the notes and get all of the clinical detail needed to make a good decision on whether we can provide the care this patient needs. The complex cases have large amounts of documentation. We're talking about patients in ICU beds that have had labs run every 12 hours for 2 weeks. You imagine just trying to go through lab data. Missed detail leads to gaps in care. Managing patient care also. We have patients with multiple complex conditions that interact, and it's very difficult, especially in a 1 or 2 hour evaluation, to really accurately gauge how all of these comorbidities interact and how they impact the patient's care. So I call it here layers of complexity. So these were two problems we really wanted to solve for, and we were looking at NLP as being part of our solution. How do we do a better job helping our clinicians make assessments and helping us to optimize the outcomes for our patients? So kind of had a three-pronged approach. First thing we need to do is get the information. It's very difficult when we have clinicians that they're reading through notes, they're getting fax documents. We're trying to move away from that. We want to get complete information from gathering it from health information exchanges. The more information we get, we can get current admission, previous admissions, the more complete picture we have of that patient. Then we get into the NLP portion of it, the clinical decision support. We want to use NLP to go through that information and do clinical decision support for our clinicians. We're not looking for the computer to make decisions. We're just looking for it to find the relevant clinical data points, bring them to the attention, and then have our clinicians confirm that. The third portion of this is advanced analytics. We've actually taken some proven clinical assessment tools and we've built them out that once we have the information built out from NLP, we'll be able to take it into these tools, very quickly assess the patients. Not only that, we'll be able to do it consistently across all of our hospitals and gauge the same patients on the same criteria. Again, this is kind of a blown out workflow. If you see everything on the left-hand side, this is our Vibra Connect information exchange. This is HealthShare. I've showed some of the examples. This is where we go back to that map with all of the hospitals. We have more than 30 state, regional, and national information exchanges that we're in the process of doing some type of onboarding with to be able to gather information just because of the dispersion of our hospitals. You come into the middle, the center of it is the NLP process. What we want to create is this clinical fact table. We have a document that we want to build for that patient that has more than 1,000 relevant clinical information points. We want to build out as much of that with the clinical decision support from the clinicians so that we can take good data about these patients and all of their needs into our analytics environment. From there, if you look, we're actually looking at it's primarily an ICU assessment tool called Apache 2. On the other side, we're looking at another assessment tool called Elixhauser. Apache 2 is really a measure of patient acuity. We're looking, even though it's not an official use, we would like to be able to look at this and track this and see how this patient's changing. Is the acuity of this patient stable over the last several days? Is the acuity rising, going down? That's going to help us, because one of the problems that we face is if we can't manage that acuity, the patient ends up going from one of our hospitals back to the acute hospital. It makes their recovery longer. It makes it more difficult on the family and the patient. It's just not a good situation. So we want to try to look at that and manage that and get a good handle on that in a very short time frame. When we get over to Elixhauser, that's actually looking in a consistent manner how all the comorbidities a patient has that are combined with the main reason they're in the hospital, how they all impact on the outcome of the patient, and what it really is going to take for that patient to recover back to some state where they can return to their life. The end is this patient assessment, and what we want to do is use it, number one, for admission planning to see if we can provide the care this patient's going to need. And then if we decide they are someone that we can provide that care to develop custom care plans that really take into account all of their needs, complete with all of the comorbidities, and manage all of those things very aggressively to give them the best outcomes. So, again, improving care with better information, using health information exchange to gather more information, clinical decision support tools, NLP, to help us gather and really pull that information together very quickly because of the short assessment time that we're often working with. Build out the clinical fact table, which is going to be our source of truth as we go into these assessment tools. Use documented assessment tools. Just an aside, if there are any physicians, don't listen for a minute. I've worked in healthcare for a long time. I'm not going to say how long, but physicians don't generally like to hear from IT people. So one of the things we looked at, we actually started to look at one of my associates out here, Chris Bryce, very bright guy with statistics. We started doing regression analysis on comorbidities, and we realized, do you know what a lift it's going to be to get physicians to accept these models that we built? So we kind of dropped back and said, well, let's start and see if we can find any proven documented assessment tools that will show us the same things, and we think that that will help our clinicians understand and accept this process much more readily than if it was just something the guys down in IT dreamed up. So just a little aside. So what we really want to do is evaluate the hospital capabilities against the needs of the patient, make sure we have a good fit to try to improve outcomes and just create an overall better experience for our patients. Again, back to that geographic diversity for health information exchange. This is a map of some of the connections that we're either in process of building or we have talked to the folks about building this. We're moving very rapidly. We believe when we're done, we'll have one of the largest networks of health information exchange in the country. So, we're very busy on that side. Using NLP to gauge patient acuity. So again, this is Apache too. It's a very proven, well-documented tool. One of the large EHRs is actually using a newer version, and it's actually a trademarked product it's one of the big 2 EHR systems. So what we want to do with this, though, is try to do a 72-hour look back prior to the patient coming to Vibra so that we can see what is happening with this patient, if their acuity level is stable, if it's rising, if it's declining. That gives us an idea what's going on across a number of fronts. What's really going on with this patient? Are they stable enough to move into one of our facilities that we'll be able to provide the care? Again, a little bit more of Apache. On the right, you'll actually see a snippet of the code. One of my other associates, who happens to be my boss, we talked him into writing the code. So he actually has taken one of our ETL tools and he's coded Apache and Elixhauser to actually be able to run in our analytics environment. Just a little bit about it. Use 12 physiologic measurements, including age, temperature, O2 sats, and other lab values. It's built around specific algorithms to build a score. So it's not a clinician trying to say, well, they have this, this, and this. They'll have actually a number that they'll be able to look at and graph that and say, this is what's going on with this patient. And if they have multiple patients, they can compare and see what their needs are. Caring for complex patients with technology. This is where we start to get into the cohorts of comorbidities. It was actually a lot of fun when Chris started doing some of the analysis on comorbidities, because we started to learn some things we really didn't expect. It was very surprising, but we did realize it was going to take months and years of analysis to really get something meaningful. That's when we started to look at something. We started with an assessment called Charlton Index. Realized that for our specific model, Elixhauser fit a little bit better, and it basically attempts to give you some idea of how all of the other needs of the patient actually combine with the main thing. We generally use DRG as our baseline, and then how to expect how quickly that patient's going to recover and what their needs are going to be. So like I said, the goal is with escalated complexity to create customized care plans to reduce the impact of disease, shorten the length of stay, get patients back to their lives. Just a very brief, this is not all-inclusive, but what this is showing is some of the weightings and some of the things that are kind of surprising when you look at it. If you look at things, like fluid and electrolyte disorders have a weighting of 11. A patient tumor that has not metastasized has a weighting of 7. So there are certain electrolyte disorders that have a much bigger impact on a patient's ability to recover than a non-metastasized tumor. That was very surprising, and I would be willing to bet as our liaisons look at patients, they're not catching this kind of detail to really understand how all of these things impact that patient and their needs. So that's just a very high-level overview. If you look at it, there are some obvious things like metastatic cancer, congestive heart failure. You expect those things are going to have some very big impacts on a patient's ability to recover. There are other things that you think would have a much larger impact that don't seem to be as significant as others. So this is, like you said, it's another tool that we're going to put in our toolkit to help people evaluate patients and what it really will take to get them back to where they want to be. So in conclusion, Vibra, we are a post-acute company. We're trying to be leaders in how we provide care for patients. We're trying to do that through gathering more information so we completely understand patients that are coming to us. NLP is a big part of this process. There's just too much information to go through in the time we have to do assessments. So we're really looking to lever technology to help us through the process and to do a better job of understanding what the patient needs. By levering this, we feel we're going to be able to use the analytics that we need that'll give us some more insight in a more timely manner. And, like I said, through the advanced analytics, it'll allow identification of subtle changes, because we would like to continue not only pre-admission, but post-admission to continue to track these things so that we can see early intervention where we see acuity spikes or other things that are going to impact the patient and their ability to recover. I went through things kind of fast. We had limited time. I don't want to keep, I know it's late in the day, but thank you for your attention. Do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, if you can go to the microphone, that would be good. I'll just give a shout out to Aluna Group,
Yes.
Alex sitting out there, and we do support and appreciate our partners. And Aluna Group is at the Startup Showcase, and really appreciate all the work that Aluna has done regarding natural language processing, and that's been wonderful.
As well as on our side, Aluna has been with us day one from our relationship with InterSystems, and really has, they're an integral part of what we're doing.
Thank you, Bill.
Yep. Okay, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Yeah, a couple of quick questions, maybe for each of you. So my first question to you on the Apache, and I assume you're post-acute centers and you're taking from different hospitals. I imagine there's variation in the data from those hospitals and what
Yes.
actually makes it to an HIE. And I would be surprised to hear, or maybe hopeful to hear, that kind of detailed Apache data actually makes it into a regional health information exchange or whatever. Or do your nurses somehow collect from the hospital and transmit to you some other method apart from an HIE?
Well, we're still in the development phase of this. We're, one of our first places that we expect to implement this is in California. We're working with Manifest MedX. We're just starting a project. We have 7 hospitals. They have pretty high expectations for the data, so we're hopeful that there will be enough relevant detail as well as coverage because of the saturation of coverage that they have in California. We're hoping that we'll have a richness of data that will really support this model.
No, I'm hopeful too.
We're
surprised
realistic too. We know, we're day one, are we going to get everything we need? Probably not. But as CMS starts to increase the data reporting requirements for the CCDs and you start to see greater adoption of interoperability, we're hoping the richness of the data improves. And by the time we have this fully functional and running across the country, we'll start to see that kind of data be available.
Okay. And if I may, one more question from early in the presentation. Have the exact problems that you have around, knowing that things are documented in the chart, diabetes, those kinds of things, or identifying people for research studies. And so we have maybe a third-party vendor that we're taking our data and transmit to them. Where are we with our stack with InterSystems to be able to do the things that we're currently having to contract out, which is exactly the things you've talked about? I mean, do we need to hire somebody that knows Python? Do we need a data scientist? So along with InterSystems and Sparks and all these other things, we have the pieces and parts, but how far are we from being able to bring that together where it would be cheaper for us to keep that in-house rather than sending it out to a third party who specializes in curating and drawing the conclusions from the data. I'll leave that
Yep.
to be answered.
So definitely appreciate it. So in the light is flashing, so I'm gonna keep my answer really short. Right now, call Alex. Okay. But at the same time, we recognize the tremendous value in clean data, which means that if we can do at very close to the data ingestion stage to apply rules to address common use cases around condition detection, which is a big one, and to be able to at least give you better diagnosis codes, incorporating information from the unstructured text as out-of-the-box capabilities, and with some embedded rules, embedded ontology supports, all that kind of stuff, and a little bit of machine learning. That's certainly our goal. But as you can see, that it's not easy, right? It's not easy. Anybody can do it. It was a consulting product. Yes, they could. And but at the same time, for a product to get to that level, it's going to take some time. So I think for now, the best thing to do is really to work with our partners like Luna Group, and they have developed a lot of expertise around building the tool sets to do exactly that. Well, I think time is up. Really appreciate it. Thanks very much, and enjoy the boat ride.